philosophical than so. I don't know what this is. I gave this talk at an alignment conference, so I added this slide. Okay, why we should care about harm. So I probably don't have to convince you, but let me do it anyway. AI systems are playing an ever-expanding role in making decisions, and this is leading to increased scrutiny of the harm and benefit caused by the decision-making makers. And in the new proposal, which is now passed, the European AI Act, it mentions the word harm over 25 times. And it says things like it's appropriate to classify AI systems as high risk if, in the light of their intended purpose, they pose a high risk of harm to blah, 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 to health and safety or the fundamental rights of persons, taking into account with the severity of the possible harm and its probability of occurrence. So they use harm a lot. This is just a fact. But if you look carefully, you'll see a footnote that says, stakeholders also highlighted that it's important to define a harm, right? So you have a notion of harm. Causing harm is bad, but what the hell is harm, right? So that's what this talks about. So defining harm has proved difficult. This is how I got into it. There's a paper by Bradley. This is not Richard Bradley. It's a different Bradley. I have much more respect for Richard Bradley than Mr. Bradley. Nobody heard me say that.
It's okay, I don't think Bradley is here.
I hope not. Unfortunately, when we look at attempts to explain the nature of harm, we find a mess. The most widely discussed account, the comparative account, faces counterexamples that seem fatal. My diagnosis is that the notion of harm is a Frankensteinian jumble. I love that. It should be replaced by other more well-behaved notions. Well, why do I not have a lot of respect for this stuff? I had written a paper defining causality, as I suspect many of you know, with you and Pearl. I've written several. And had he only read my paper, which, by the way, was published in the British Journal of Philosophy of Science, which is a philosophy journal, this guy's a philosopher, and has at this point, I think, over 1,000 citations. So it's not exactly an obscure paper. He would have seen that at least half of his problems disappeared, but he didn't read my paper. So he gets my wrath. But it gives me the opportunity to write a paper. So it turns out that one major step towards solving the problems that Bradley raises is to take causality into account. So that's why it's called causal analysis of harm. So, yeah, they seem to be unaware of the last 20 years of work in defining causality. So there's another key feature, which turns out to be, I think, really interesting, and has a lot of psychological motivation, which is the notion of the default utility. And the way you should think about the default utility is, roughly speaking, my default utility is what I'm expecting to get in the situation, more or less. And there's harm only if the agent is worse off than they expect to be, or expect to be is defined by the default utility. Now, of course, different agents can disagree on the default, so it depends on the model, whether or not there's harm, because part of the model will include a default, so let me make that precise. So, how many people here do not know the standard Pearl model of structural equations? Raise your hand if you don't know. It's okay not to know. Okay, I'll tell you enough that'll hopefully be good enough for this talk. So the world is described by variables that affect each other. This effect is modeled by structural equations. So the people who don't know, do you know what Bayesian networks are?
Yeah.
So think Bayesian networks where you have an acyclic graph, each node is associated with a variable, but instead of each variable, instead of having a conditional probability table that tells you what's the probability of variable x conditional on the values of its parents, that would be a standard Bayesian network. You have an equation that tells you what's the value of x as a function of the values of its parents. Right? So we replace the conditional probability table by an equation, or set of equations, because for each different set of values of the parents, we're going to have a different value for this it's okay, because I made 2 months. Or not. So that's what I mean by a causal law. And I'm going to have an equation for each endogenous variable. So I've split the variables into exogenous and endogenous. And for the purposes of this talk, think of the exogenous variables as being the ones at the root of the DAG. Their values don't come from equations, they come from the outside. But for the endogenous variables, the ones not the root, their values are determined by the equations. Is that good enough? Okay. And I should say that having the equation x equals y plus u doesn't mean that y equals x minus c. The intuition for the equation is if I were to set y to 3 and u to 5, x would be 8. It does not follow that if I were to set x to 8 and u to 5, that y would be 3. The equations model the effect of interventions. I mean, so think about the real world. We really want this. So we have causal graphs just like Bayesian networks, but at the top we have the exogenous variables. So we assume that the graph is acyclic. For the purpose of this talk, it doesn't have to be. So once I tell you what we call a context, which is a setting of the exogenous variables, that determines everything else because of the equations. So once I tell you, here are the values of the variables at the top, well, you can sort of go down the tree and figure out the values of everything else using the equations. Does that make sense? Is that obvious?
Mm-hmm.
Again, feel free to interrupt, it's not such a big crowd.
So there's one solution always to the equation?
Yeah, it's a unique solution.
Okay.
There's no probability at this point. That's actually important. I'm a fan of probability, I'll add probability later, but for now there's no probability. So, hold on. So here is an incomplete definition of causality. It's not quite right, but it's good enough for the purposes of this talk. I mean, if it were this simple, I wouldn't have had to write so many papers. But we wanted to find what it means for capital X equals little x rather than capital X equals little x prime to be a causal phi. Now traditionally in the literature, we don't have contrastive causality, we just talk about what it means for x being little x to be a causa phi. But this is really close, and it's basically the same definition. And what we're trying to capture is if we were to intervene to change the value of capital X from little x to x prime, phi goes from being true to false. Now, why do I have those little arrows over the x's? It's because in general, x is a vector of variables, not a single variable. So think of x as being, if I want to talk about what it means for x1 being 3 and x2 being 2 and x3 being 5 to be a cause of phi, whatever phi is, rather than some other setting. Okay? And again, this is not quite right. What's not right is AC2, it's not good enough. But the definition has 3 clauses. The first one is I would never say x equals little x is a cause of phi unless x really were little x and phi was true. Right? I'm not going to say the fact that, that I punched Daniel in the nose and he fell over. So the fact that I punched him in the nose is a cause of him falling over. I just wouldn't say that if I didn't punch him in the nose and he didn't fall over. Definitely can't right? I mean, think about English. This is just a claim of how we use the words in English. And the third clause, I think, is also pretty non-controversial. That saying that vector x is minimal. I don't want to have unnecessary. So think of x as being a conjunct of things. I don't want to have unnecessary conjuncts. So I want to say, okay, the fact that I punch him in the nose is the cause of him falling over. Suppose I also sneeze at the same time. I don't want to say that me punching in the nose and sneezing is a cause of him falling over. Sneezing is irrelevant. So I want to prune away irrelevant conjuncts. So AC1 and AC3 are pretty non-controversial. AC2 is much more complicated than, or somewhat more complicated at least, than what I have here, but let me give you the simple version, which is good enough for this talk. If you want more, I can definitely point you to write papers. And it's just what lawyers call but-for causality. It just says that if I were to change x to x prime, phi wouldn't happen, you'd get phi prime. Where phi prime is different from phi. If we're talking about Boolean formulas, phi prime would be not phi. But you don't have to.
What did you say the lawyers call that?
Sorry?
What did you say the lawyers call that?
But for causality.
But for
A is a cause of B if, but for A, B would not have occurred. So x equals x is a cause of phi if, but for the fact that x equals x, phi wouldn't have occurred.
So it's basically saying if phi doesn't occur by default, but phi does occur if intervention, then the intervention must be.
Roughly, yeah. Again, it's a bit more complicated than that, but that's not a bad intuition. Yeah.
So just clarifying, so like if someone is falling down from the sky and is about to hit the ground and die,
Right.
and I shoot the person 2 feet off the ground,
Right.
then killing the person, then I didn't cause the person to die on this because of AC2 being violated.
Yeah, well, but the real truth is it's more complicated than
Okay,
AC2.
I just want to
Yeah.
make sure I
Right,
understood
yeah.
the document. Yeah.
Okay.
Was
Yeah.
that I don't understand that notation for AC2.
Sorry?
What is bracket?
Oh, sorry, I should have said. It says if I were to intervene and set x to x prime, then phi prime is true. So the bracket means if I were to intervene and set x to x prime. Dan.
So I just want to make sure I understood your response to Ben. So I was unclear if what you said was yes, according to this, Ben wouldn't have killed the person, or if you maybe meant both, that the
well,
fixed
yes, according
version of
to that.
AC2 would say that Ben killed the person. Is that true?
Certainly, according to this definition, he would not be a cause.
And the fixed definition would Ben then?
So let me think a second. If you model things right, he would be a cause of shooting. But this depends on how you model things. It depends on the model. But this issue won't arise in this talk, so let's not get
So
into it.
there's like 2 seconds between for which he caused the person to be dead, and then after that he did not cause the person to be dead.
No. We don't have formulas like that in the language. So you either were a cause or you weren't. There's no notion of being a cause for 2 seconds and then stopping to be a cause. All right. So qualitative harm. Let me give you a formal definition. So a causal model for harm consists of a causal model. So a causal model has exogenous variables and endogenous variables and equations, intuitively the graph. A utility function u, which I'll explain in a second, and a default utility d. Now, the utility, one special variable is called the outcome. That's just for convenience, but it just makes things easier. The utility is defined on the outcomes. Right, so I might have a bunch of variables. The only one that affects utility is the outcome. So I can talk about the utility of an outcome. And the default utility is just another number. Are we together? Again, I think you've learned it's okay to interrupt me, and I think I should be fine in terms of time. So, and if not, Evelyn will tell me different. So here's the formal definition. Capital X equals little x causes harm to an agent if there exists an outcome O such that in the actual world the utility of O is less than default, the actual outcome gives the agent less than the expected utility, right? Because the agent had an expectation, that expectation is modeled by the default, so you're doing worse than you expected. Yeah. And there exists an O prime and an X prime such that X equals X rather than X equals X prime causes O rather than O prime, and the utility of O is less than the utility of O prime. Let me read you the high-level English that tries to parse that unparsable statement. So switching to an alternative X prime, right? You start out with X. Switching to X prime would result in an outcome O prime, right? Because it causes, switching to x prime causes O prime rather than O, would result in an outcome O prime that's better than O. What does better mean? It has a higher utility. So the utility of outcome O prime is higher than that of O. Right? So again, you cause harm if the actual outcome resulted, the utility of the actual outcome is worse than your expectation, and there's something you could have done that would have made things better. That's what the second thing is saying. Yeah. So that's the definition. And we showed, just by walking through all the examples in Bradley's paper that, yes, we can deal with them all. So much for his claim that it's a Frankensteinian jumble and it's a lost cause. This is my revenge. I don't know, I mean, when we hear about research, everybody makes it sound like, oh yes, it's all pristine, we're all in an ivory tower, and emotions don't get into the act. No, not true. I read the paper and I was annoyed. And I said, oh, I'm annoyed, and I'm going to do something about it. So I did. Now, I did something I like to think is constructive, but nevertheless, let me confess, up front, that definitely part of my motivation here was my annoyance. There's ways about it. Yeah.
Would you say they caused this paper?
Yes, I would say his paper was one of the causes of this paper. I would, indeed.
I'm missing something important, or maybe you're getting to it, but like if you thoroughly expect me to harm you, that's the default or no?
Oh, well,
so that if I do then,
so we sidestep that question.
I see.
In the sense that we say, whether or not there's harm is relevant to a model. Part of the definition of model is the default utility. So we don't, we do, I mean, we say, well, figuring out what the right default utility is certainly highly non-trivial, and people can disagree, but as far as the definition goes, not an issue because we're not worried about where the default utility came from.
Bradley couldn't retreat to that? I mean,
I think our choices, what we show in all the examples, the default utility, I think Bradley would agree, is pretty reasonable, right? I mean, I don't want to say everybody would always agree on the choice of default utility, but his examples are not complicated because the default utility is so hard to figure out or so hard to agree on. That's my feeling. Now, I haven't talked to Bradley about it, so you can look at the paper and judge for yourself. But I don't think that's where the action is. I think in some real world problems, figuring out that the default utility is a big deal, just not in the particular problems that Bradley focuses on.
35
that's fine.
remaining.
Yeah. Oh, so it's not Evelyn and Sue who's my timer.
Both of us. It's both of us, I guess. Yeah.
So two people are going to come down hard on me if I. So let me give you an example of where defaults could play a role. So suppose Alice has a $30 meal in a restaurant but decides not to tip the waiter, keeps the money to herself. Did she harm the waiter? Well, in a country like the US, it's customary to tip 15 to 20%. It seems to keep going up. Let's not worry about that. Then we can take the default for the waiter to be, let's say, 15%. We usually think of the default as the lower bound. And in that case, Alice does harm the waiter. She doesn't tip him. He gets less than he's expecting. And she definitely could have taken an act that would have resulted in him doing better. Let's assume she has money in her wallet or that she can put her on a credit card. On the other hand, in Japan, tips are not expected. The default is you do not tip. So in Japan, I would say the waiter is, Japanese waiter, is not harmed because he or she is expecting not to be tipped at all, and indeed, they don't get tipped, right? So this is my understanding of Japan. If I'm wrong, let me know, but nobody's complained about it before. Even if I'm wrong, let's pretend it's true, right? That's the point. The point I want to make is whether or not tipping counts as harm depends on the expectation of the waiter. Does that? Okay. And I will say there seems to be lots of evidence from psychology that people do have such default utilities. And I'm working now with Toby Gerstenberg, who's in the causality department at Stanford. and we're hoping to run experiments to show that indeed seems to be how people are computing harm. I mean, so there's no question that people have default expectations. There's lots of experiments to show that. We're saying more. We're saying that those default expectations affect how you determine whether or not there's been harm. It seems like a pretty plausible next step. My impression is, and Toby agrees, and he knows that much better than I do, that this actually hasn't been proved. Although again, I suspect most of the community would agree with that expectation. Yeah.
Yeah, so we've been talking about the expectation, and it feels like in different settings in this conversation so far, we've been having a different notion of whose expectation is.
That's a fair point.
So when you gave the mathematical formalism, I was thinking of, what is the non-determinism inherent in the system, and then I can say, there's some probability distribution over trajectories. But once you say something like it's a subject's expectation of what's going to happen, then according to your definition, I can harm you by telling you some true information, which makes you expect that you'll be worse off.
So that's a very fair point. To some extent, the paper punts on it by saying, look, default is part of the model. We can, after the fact, debate why you chose that default, whether that's a reasonable default in the real world. It's a really important debate, but I want to separate out, I want to come back to this because I think it's a really important issue. So I'm not denying its importance, but I want to separate out how you compute the default and how you interpret the default from here's the definition given that there's a default. Okay, so that what I've told you here is here's the definition given that there's a default. Now, as a separate matter, you're absolutely right to focus on where the hell is this default coming from. So let's put that on the stack. And I totally agree it's an important problem. So, but I just want to have a thorough discussion and not give you a flip answer here. So, I mean, the answer for here is it's part of the model and harm is relative to a model. Done, go away. But you shouldn't leave it away.
Okay.
So did I? You'll notice this at the bottom, deciding the right default is not trivial. That's exactly the last line. So, it's not like we're unaware of this problem. Not that we have a great solution, but we are aware. Okay, up to now I've talked about qualitative harm. That is to say, a certain action caused harm or it didn't. So it's a yes-no kind of thing. But obviously, in the real world, we want to know, okay, how much harm did it cause? And there's a pretty straightforward way to extend these definitions to quantitative harm, where you just look at the gap between, okay, so there's all this ugly math. Let me say it in English, and you'll trust me, the math is capturing English right. You compare the utility obtained by the agent given the act you perform, that's U of O, to what would have been obtained if x equals x prime had happened, and to the default D and take the minimum. So if I'm comparing the harm caused by doing x rather than x prime, so this is a first step to computing the quantitative harm caused. So first I'm going to compute how much harm was there because you did x rather than x prime. Are we together? So I say, okay, here's the utility you got from x. Let me compare it to the default. If it's above the default, there was no harm. If it's below the default, then the first candidate for harm is the gap between the default and what you got from doing x. But there's another candidate for harm, and that's what you would have obtained if you'd done x equals x prime instead of x equals x. So take the minimum of those two, and by fiat, I'm going to say that's the harm caused by doing x instead of x prime. I'm not done yet, but that's the first step. Daniel, should I answer your question now?
Yes, a quick question. There's a lot going on, so I might be missing something.
Right.
Okay, so you just defined as the maximum of that thing, and as part of the embedded, you're taking a utility of O prime, let's say, if
Right.
that ends up being the minimum, and subtracting the utility of O. So I'm
Right.
curious how we think of the utility functions here, because if I multiply the representation by 1,000,000,000,000, it might look like the harm is the quantitative harm is a lot more than if I multiplied it by
That's a good point.
a half.
And-
Like, is there a
yeah.
certain
I would think you'd want to normalize. We don't really address that in the paper, but I mean, I think it's a good point, because you don't want to say just because I multiplied all the utilities by
That's
5.
right. You really harmed me or something.
Yeah, that all of a sudden I have much greater harm,
Yeah.
even though it's essentially an identical problem.
Yeah.
So that's a fair point. I think a reasonable way to address that is to normalize, but, and I don't see any intrinsic difficulty doing that, but I haven't thought it through.
So I thought that O prime was going to be the default because we're talking about causing O rather than O prime, in which case the way that I would quantify harm would be U of O prime minus U of O.
Well, so first of all, the default is just a number, whereas O prime is an outcome.
Oh,
So you can talk about the utility of O prime, which would give you a number, but you don't want to talk about O prime being the default. That's a type mismatch. As I say, by default, the default is like 3, whereas O prime is I didn't get tipped, right? But bear with me. I think you'll like what I'm about to say. So the actual quantitative harm is you look over all O primes and X primes and take the worst case, right? So what I gave you was the harm caused if you did X rather than X prime, but maybe you could have done something better than X prime. So look at the best thing you could have done. That's why I'm taking the max down here at the bottom. See the max? So look at the act that maximizes that difference, and the O prime that maximizes that difference, and that's the harm. Which, if you start playing with examples, I would argue that you'll be convinced pretty fast that it's a reasonable choice. But given that my timekeeper is going to tell me I don't have that much time left, I'm going to keep going, unless there's questions. Yeah.
Why do you have both X prime and O prime in the maximum of things you're
Because you compare, well, certainly you want X prime, because you're saying, let's look at the alternative that makes things as bad as possible. And
Sorry for the harm.
I think you could probably get away without the O prime in the deterministic setting, because O prime is determined by X prime. But it's handy in the definition to have the O prime there to do this computation. Is there another question?
What about the O though? The O is on the right hand side, disappears on the left hand side.
That's right.
There's an O.
Yes. O is the actual utility you got.
I'm just saying the left hand side has no O.
It does. The last 2 terms are O and O prime.
No, on the left of the equals. The left hand side has no O.
On the bottom.
Oh, on the bottom.
Yeah.
Oh, that looks right. So there's no O here, nor is there an X prime, because I'm maxing over X prime and O prime. Oh, I see. But you're saying there's no O. There should have been an O. That's a typo. Sorry. All right. Back to Alice in the restaurant. Now suppose Alice eats a meal for $50. The waiter's utility for tip is, if you get a tip of X dollars, your utility is X. The default utility is $7.50, 15%. Unfortunately, tips can only be given in cash, and Alice has only $5 in her wallet. If she gives a $5 tip, then according to this definition, there's no harm done. She could not have given more. Right? So when we're maximizing over feasible actions. It just wasn't feasible to give $7.50. Now you could say, well, she could have run to an ATM and gotten more money. Then it's a question of how you model the problem. So if you're saying she really could have given $7.50 by going to an ATM, no problem. I mean, I'm not saying you're wrong. I'm saying that you need a different model. In that model, the harm would be larger. Right? So again, this is all relative to a model. And if she has $10 in her wallet and gives a tip of $7.50, then the harm is 0, even though she could have given more, because as soon as you hit the gap between what you gave and the default, there's no more harm, right? So, all right. Suppose we have uncertainty about what happened or will happen in the world. So now I'm going to bring in probability. I said I would. That amounts to putting a probability on contexts, the stuff at the top of the tree. Yep. We can compute the harm in each context, and then we can compute the expected harm. No problem. This can work quite differently from expected utility. This is where things get interesting. Yet another decision. And let's see. I mean, so a doctor has a choice of either prescribing medication, let's call that x equals 1, or performing surgery, let's call that x equals 0. Those are the only two options. The medication keeps the patient stable, but doesn't completely cure the patient. So you get outcome 1 if you get the medication, which is you're stable. The surgery cures the patient completely with high probability. Think of P being very small. But there is a small probability of the patient dying or having a very bad outcome. Okay, this is quite real world. I mean, that's why you sign all these forms saying, yes, I understand. There's a small probability that something might go wrong. I absolve the doctor, I absolve the hospital, I won't sue them, blah, 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 right? I mean, this is exactly the point. There always is a small probability that something will go wrong. Now, I'm making up these numbers. The numbers don't matter. As you'll see, the point will come out pretty much for any reasonable choice of numbers. So assume that the utility of outcome 1, which is that you're stable, is 0.5. The utility of outcome 0, which is that you recover completely, is 1. And the utility of outcome 2, which is that you die, is 0. The expected utility of x equals 1 is 0.5. The expected utility of x equals 0, which is performing the surgery, is 1 minus p. And again, if you don't like these numbers, come up with different numbers. You can always simulate this kind of thing. The point is, think of p as being very small. P is the probability that something goes wrong with the surgery. So if you're an expected utility maximizer, you surely want to do the surgery. Because you say, okay, there is a small chance that something will go wrong. It is extremely small, that's what the doctors told me. And you sign the form. I sign the form, right? And I suspect almost everybody does. Well, let's see what happens with harm. So again, don't worry about the details of the math is trivial. The point is, if P is small enough, doing the surgery is going to maximize expected utility. And I hope that's intuitively obvious. Now, let's think about the defaults. If the default utility is 1, which intuitively says, look, I've been healthy all my life, I have this, whatever it is that's causing me a problem, I'm on this medication, I really can't stand it. I want to go back to being completely healthy. And that's my default. Well, if that's your default, then the harm caused by x equals 1, that is to say, continuing with the medication, is 0.5, and the expected harm is caused by x equals 0, which is having surgery, is p. And minimizing expected harm would again lead to choosing x equals 0. It's basically the same answer you got by maximizing expected utility. But here's the big but. Suppose the default utility is 0.5. Think of the patient as having taken this medication for a long time. You know, it's not great, but he's still alive and doing okay. Yes, of course, he'd rather be completely cured, but you know, that risk of death looms large, even if the probability is small. You can't tell me he's crazy that it looms large. And I claim that x equals 1 has expected harm 0. If you continue with the medication, you're getting your default. Done. No harm. On the other hand, if x equals 0 has positive expected harm, because there is this very small probability that you'll die, and you'll have a harm of 0.5 even though I've chosen the numbers. It doesn't matter how I chose the numbers. The point is that the expected harm is 0 if you're expecting, if your default is you continue the way you feel the default, and your expected harm is positive if Doesn't matter how small p is as long as p is positive.
Mhm.
Right? Are we together here?
Mhm.
So the point is that this example breaks, it says that you're getting different answers depending on whether you're minimizing expected harm or maximizing expected utility. It matters. And what clearly matters here is the choice of default. Now, I'm not going to tell you what the right default is. We could debate it, and the doctor might try to convince you that, hey, you shouldn't worry so much about dying. But yeah, is that crazy? Yeah.
Is this coming from that we clamped harm to need to be non-negative, in the sense that, similarly, if I had a helpfulness measure and then I harmed you a bunch, then I would expect to get something like a negative helpfulness measure. Whereas utility still have to be negative, so then I expect these things to diverge in various ways.
I see. So no, I don't think that this example, I don't think it matters at all that we've made harm non-negative.
Okay.
Now, I haven't talked about benefit yet, so stay tuned for that. So here I've just focused on harm, which I would argue is not unreasonable, because people do focus on harm, and you get things like, first do no evil, right? Statements like first do no evil are more or less saying, do not cause harm. They're not saying, figure out the benefit, figure out the harm, and try to maximize the cost benefit. They're saying, do no evil, no harm.
They're sort of implicitly saying that though.
Well, conveyed.
Like, they allow you to do surgery and cut someone open.
I understand, but is somebody crazy for not taking the surgery in this case? I would say no. So, how much time do I have? Because I'll just get this stuff and probably waiting.
About 20 minutes.
Oh, 20 minutes, no problem. So research has shown that the probability of a fatal accident when driving at the speed limit is 1 in a million. Let's say, I made up these numbers, but the details don't matter. Driving at 80% of the speed limit results in 50% fewer fatal accidents. And driving at the speed limit, so the probability of a fatal accident when driving at 80% of the speed limit is 1 in 2 million. The majority of people drive at the speed limit and would prefer buying an autonomous car, and it does so as well. This preference remains even after people have been informed of these numbers. So an autonomous car company needs to decide whether a car should drive at the maximum speed allowed or at 80% of the speed allowed. Now, it's a fairly easy computation to show, if you model things in a reasonable way, that you maximize expected utility for reasonable choices of numbers. Let me not go through the details. By driving 80% of the speed limit, right? Because that small probability of avoiding a serious accident, well, if your utility of a serious accident is low enough, as in you might die, then you're willing to drive at 80% of the speed limit, at least if you're maximizing expected utility. But people aren't. Why? So it's interesting, there's a lot of work in the decision theory community on probability weighting. That in practice, people ignore the possibility of a fatal accident. They underweight that probability, treating the 10 to the minus 6, which is the most likely probability of a fatal accident, as 0. More generally, this is an idea due to John Quiggin. We can compute the weighted expected harm. This is different from the last time. Replacing each probability by the weighted probability, which is how people are perceiving that probability. And if your weight function treats 10 to the minus 6 as 0, well, clearly you should drive it at the speed limit, not 80% of the speed limit, because no damage done if you drive at the speed limit. You're treating the probability of something going wrong as 0. Now, it's interesting. There's arguments that everything goes back to Hana and Tversky. Well, at least this does, among many other things. Because people are limited in their ability to comprehend and evaluate extreme probabilities, numbers close to 0 and close to 1, highly unlikely events are either neglected or overweighted. And the difference between high probability and certainty is either neglected or exaggerated. This is a quote. Thus, small probabilities generate unpredictable behavior, and we observe two opposite reactions to small probabilities. Now, there's been a lot of work on this in psychology community. Ido Elef, for example, is one person who's done a lot of work. People underweight probabilities when they make, so this is the common explanation, I think it's still the most common explanation. The people underweight probabilities when they make decisions from experience, based on their past experience with events of interest. So if you think about, well, how many of my friends have had a fatal accident? Because they were speaking. I can't think of any. Probability is 0. On the other hand, if I had a friend who had a fatal accident last week, watch me drive slowly and overestimate that probability, right? That's what they mean by making decisions from experience. You have a sample space of your experiences, including your friends and so on. So my point is here, when you're evaluating harm, things get subtle. So let me, now, things get even more subtle if you have different individuals. Why does this matter? We're really interested in helping policymakers choose actions. We being like me, psychologists, not just the community at large. And typically the kind of policies they're looking at affect the whole society. Right? We're not talking about individuals. So you have to say, okay, even assuming I could evaluate, let's say you bought my definition. Even assuming that for each individual you could evaluate harm, how do you evaluate societal harm? This is tricky. Well, first of all, there's the problem of, a well-known problem in decision theory, interpersonal utilities. I evaluate this outcome as a 5, you evaluate it as a 3. Now, is that because we really feel differently about it? Or is the semantics of my 5 the same as the semantics of your 3? So that's one big problem, but again, it's not new to this, it's a well-known problem in decision theory. So let me show you some examples where this helps, but let me stress, this is a real world issue. You're a policymaker trying to decide where to place a garbage disposal site or whether to increase the minimum wage. People might get harmed. Some people get harmed, some won't. How do you decide? Sometimes using the default solves some problems. I don't want to push this one too hard, but let me do it anyway. Suppose that Billy's a healthy person strolling by a hospital. In the hospital, there are 5 patients in need of a heart, liver, kidney, lung, and pancreas transplant, respectively. Suppose, for simplicity, these patients will die without the transplant is not available elsewhere or in time. While Billy will die if these organs are harvested from. Expected utility maximization would suggest that saving 5 lives is better than saving 1. So the hospital should kidnap Billy, kill him, harvest his organs, and if we take the default, that's in terms of maximizing expected utility. On the other hand, if we take the default, the Bill and each of the patients continue in their current state of health. So by default, the patients that are going to die figure that's my life, so to speak, or my death. Then harvesting Billy's organs clearly harms Billy. He's not expecting to lose his organs, but doesn't harm any. It doesn't help anybody else to give them the organs, given that we're focusing on harm. So that solves this problem, kind of. But defaults certainly don't solve all problems. And here's what I think is a really interesting research area. I have done some work in fairness, and it seems that issues of collective harm are closely related to issues of fairness. Here's what to think about. I'm trying to decide where to put a highlight. I'm trying to decide who should be required to go back to work given the COVID epidemic. Who are the emergency workers who have to go back by law, right? We professors, we have this cushy job, we get to stay home. Now, inevitably, different groups are going to be harmed disproportionately. So it's just a fact that the people who got, people of color and people with low salaries were much, much more likely to be emergency workers than people like me. So if all you're doing to compute group harm, even assuming you can deal with the interpersonal utility issue, is, okay, say the harm of a group is just the sum of the harms of the individuals, you're not gonna get at this disproportionate harm. So it could be that if you just weight everybody equally and you say, okay, well, too bad, but this is the solution that minimizes total harm. But that doesn't seem right. So how can you deal with that?
You could use the universal solvent of mechanism design and introduce side payments. If you really care about people coming into work, you can pay them more to offset the harm that they are being having disproportionately inflicted on them until you get to a point where they are on net slightly glad
if that was feasible, right? I mean, suppose I'm Joe Biden back in the day. Even if I buy what you're saying, implementing it seems incredibly complicated. I understand the mechanism.
Yeah. Basically, I was just sort of going.
So could you?
If you gotta harm someone for the greater good,
Right.
then a good guideline for when you can do that is if you're getting enough that is, the benefit is way bigger than the harm, and if it is, then why the heck are you paying them with the surplus?
What about if you have a not particularly well-educated population, and we convince people they ought to, just get $100 increase in wage, they ought to be happy with that. And then some lawyer comes along and says, no, you should have asked for 1,000. Right? I mean, the mechanism that you're proposing assumes, so to speak, that everybody understands what the appropriate amount is to get paid, which is far from obvious to me. So that even if you assume that you could implement this mechanism,
dealing with everyone arguing about the appropriate amounts to extra to pay is going to be.
Right, and on top, I mean, certainly the amount you need to pay me might be different from the amount you need to pay somebody else. That's perfectly reasonable. But again, that assumes that I and whoever else you're paying understand all the issues and understand how these numbers are being calculated. Deciding what the appropriate amount is. It's certainly not trivial, right? So I'm not objecting. I'm just saying you can't just sort of say, oh, here's a solution, no problem, we're done. I think it's much more subtle than that.
Yeah.
So we suggest the solution in the paper. I don't particularly want to push it. I think this is a really interesting question. So there seem to be deep connections between the fairness problem as studied in the literature typically and this kind of fairness to groups when you're trying to minimize harm. Now, as you mentioned, another big problem is how do you decide what the default ought to be? So we have some suggestions, but
I think, wouldn't this sort of require that you know what the groups are ahead of time? Because otherwise you can always draw a group around the exact set
in
of
our
people who are
solution,
harmed.
we give a solution with respect to a set of groups.
All right.
You can't form groups on the fly in an ad hoc way.
Okay.
I think that's a reasonable thing to do precisely because you can always, after the fact, define a group against
the
harm.
group of people who were harmed by this here thing.
I don't want to allow that.
Yeah.
And society would have to agree, are these reasonable groups in this context?
Mm-hmm.
Right, so, okay, let me briefly talk about harm versus benefit, and then I'll be done. So, this is the second last slide. In many situations, we need to trade off benefits to harms. This is certainly not controversial. Many authors view benefit as the opposite of harm. We want to argue that might not be true, specifically because the default for harm might not be the same as the default for benefit. That is, you can use our approach for computing what's the benefit of this, just like, and the definition looks the same, except that instead of having a default utility for harm, we have a default utility for benefit. And in general, they're not equal. You get a present, or you get a tip. intuitively, at least the way we're thinking about it, you have a range of possible tips you think are reasonable. Let's say 15 to 20%. If you get below 15%, you've been harmed. If you get above 20%, your upper end, then you got a real benefit. And that means that one will not be the negative of the other. So we'd like to understand that issue better. Is that right? Is that how people think about it? So I should say that and this is my last slide. We've given a definition of quantitative harm. It's relatively straightforward in the case of a single individual, but lots of issues with multiple individuals. So lots of work to be done. And to me, the really big question is understanding whether these definitions capture or come close to the way people think about harm. I'm given a definition. Well, I mean, you go to a court, or policymaker uses our definition of harm, it comes up with a policy, and people look at it and say, what a stupid policy. How did you ever come up with that decision? And the policymaker carefully explains, I read this, Beckers, Chockler, Halpern paper, and I just follow their prescriptions. Here's the default utility that I chose, and I got, okay. So part of the problem is you might agree with the definition, just not agree with the default utility chosen. But it could be, you look at it and say, what a stupid way to think about harm. So one thing we want to understand is to what extent do people think about harm the way we're suggesting. That's to be precise, but we'd be much firmer ground if we could point out experiments where this seems to be the way people are thinking about harm. And again, the idea of defaults, it's pretty clear that people have defaults and think in terms of defaults. That's not controversial. Now the question is, do they use them when calculating harm? And I think once we've got that, there's a bunch of other issues, but to me, the second big one is the one that you mentioned, is how they compute the defaults. Because you're a policymaker. So it's one thing to say the defaults are subjective, you have your default, I have mine, right? But I'm a policymaker. Well, I'm happy if you choose my default, but why are you choosing mine? So is there a way to compute, so to speak, a societal default? That's a good question. We have some thoughts. Part of it uses the notion of normality that I have in my book on causality, but research to be done. Okay, and on that note, with 5 minutes to spare, perfect. I am done, but I'm certainly open to questions. Yeah.
I guess this is related to the how do you compute the default, remember the default. So in some of the earlier examples, the default was something like a reasonable expectation someone would have about how she was treated, like the waitress in America versus Japan. But it seems like then when you bring up the issues around discrimination and fairness, it seems like you almost want the opposite, right? Like maybe just for historical reasons, people of marginalized groups expect to be treated poorly, and
That's
people
true.
of advantaged groups really expect to be. So the notion of default is almost like
It gets even
the
worse.
wrong kind of name for it in a sense, because
it gets
like
even worse.
yeah.
Because you can imagine companies, not just imagine this happens, deliberately trying to lower expectations.
Right.
Right?
Yeah.
Think theoretically, right? This happens all the time. I mean, I'm sure, if I spoke to somebody, there would be examples of this, that how are you going to do in the debate tomorrow when you try to lower expectations, right? And so it's not like the default is out there and it's objective. The players in a multi-group setting are actively trying, or at least in general, are actively trying to affect the default. And of course the policymaker has to be attentive to that.
If default goes by someone's expectation, but you might just break that connection, say actually the default for this purpose, we want to really not be someone's expectation, like in the case of marginalized groups where maybe there is a super strong expectation in terms of credence.
I
not
don't
in
want to
terms
say
of
much because I haven't thought it through.
Yeah.
But it seems to me a really important problem. So that's what I was saying to you, that in our paper we have really nothing to say about the problem beyond acknowledging that it's a problem. So we understand that it's a problem. And in the paper the default is just one of the parameters of the model. That is what it is. But in the real world, especially if you're a policymaker, you need to have guidelines for how to compute that default that you can be transparent about to whoever you're making a policy for. They might disagree, but at least you're transparent. And if they disagree, you know, you can imagine a council of experts that get together and try to figure out the default, you know, with representation from all the appropriate communities. And maybe defaults will be different for different communities. I can certainly imagine that. So if you have relatively few communities, so somebody there was saying that we define the communities up front. We don't sort of create the communities on the fly. But you can imagine having defined the communities up front, we might very well want different defaults for different communities. We have examples where that seems reasonable. So these are definitely issues. I don't want to pretend. I have not solved this problem. I think it's a really interesting problem, but I saw a hand here.
Maybe one interesting feature of having a default is that if you had the omega predictor, nobody would ever harm anybody because the expectation would be actually what happens.
So what's an omega predictor?
Oh, if you had some predictor that was just right all the time.
But what would it be right about?
Oh, about what is the score that you will get in the future. But as in, you'll get some outcome and then you say you assign that outcome a number, and we're talking about expectation over what score you end up getting. So,
I see, but different people can have different scores.
And so if
And
you
they would have to
perfect
trust
something,
that this omega predictor.
I'm just making the observation that if you were perfect at this prediction, so like my first
I see, so
thought
Newton's
was-
paradox, if you had a predictor that knew what was gonna happen, or was great at predicting what was gonna happen, then you could come up with a reasonable default.
Yeah. So
Okay, you still have to.
I think the point is that it might mess with the definition of harm because the definition of harm sort of relies on the gap between like your expectations and what actually happens. If you got like really good predictions.
That my concern would be, it still might be the case that different groups, you might want to do things differently. So if your omega predictor gave you an answer for people of color, you still might want to deal with that differently than if they gave you an answer for rich white folks with incomes over $10 million. Maybe not. Maybe, you know, I mean, but at least it bears thinking about.
So maybe this reframes the question in terms of the way in which we want to mess up the predictor. So we could either rate limit it and make it less smart in general, or we could make it aspirational and pick whatever default value that it expects for a certain scenario. We add plus epsilon, so we're always getting better in a certain sense.
Maybe. So all I can say is topic for further research. But I saw more questions here. Yeah.
I don't have a good understanding of what the previous literature on this looked like, and so then what the criticisms were. So my question is, like, when you're setting this out, what's the problem that you're trying to solve? How does this compare to previous
So
definitions
certainly when we
of
started, the problem we were trying to solve was to come up with a definition of harm. And the previous literature that we were taking off from was the Bradley paper and a few other related papers that were more or less saying, oh my God, it's really hard to define harm. And we wanted to say, you know, it's not so bad. In most of the philosophy literature that I'm aware of, nobody had considered quantitative harm. They were too hung up on qualitative harm and saying that this is a lost cause. Now, there is now in the computer science literature, and certainly if you look at policymakers, I mean, it's easy to come up with cases where policymakers have to decide on a policy. And you might say they should be trying to minimize harm. Now, they might not agree. They might want to maximize expected utility or something. But if you believe that they should be trying to minimize expected harm, then this whole issue of how you define the default, which is definitely not an issue when you're maximizing expected utility, comes up in space, at least if you buy our definition, which you don't have to. I'm not aware of any work that, I started talking about it with the students, so I shouldn't say I'm not aware of any work. I am aware of some work, but it's unpublished and it's still a bit up in the air, that tries to come up with a good definition of how you get to expected harm from, well, in our case we're looking at normality. So there's a whole theory of normality that I have. So, I think Evelyn, you had a question?
I'm not sure, let me get back.
Okay, you're on hold until you say otherwise. Other questions? Yeah.
So I'm worried about the fact that, as you said, like the way you model the set of actions is gonna like drastically impact whether you're harm or not. And I feel like as the default set of actions, I kind of want to be like, what could you actually do in the real world?
Right.
But I think this gets into like really weird situations where like, for though, like if, let's say, if there's anyone in the world that like is below their default harm, I could fly to them and hand them a lot of cash, and that seems like, although I could technically do that, it's not really harming them not to do that. So I guess, is there a principled way that you can like restrict actions to sort of what we think of as reasonable without having these
So
restrictions?
the set of feasible actions, this is already an issue in standard decision theory. It's not unique to our setting at all. So again, the modeler has to decide in each setting what are the set of feasible actions. It's not for me to tell you what they should be. If you want to allow an action where you can come to me and say, you're the only one here who seems to be harmed, let me give you $1 million, will you shut up if I give you $1 million? Yep, I'll shut up if you give me $1 million. Problem solved. If that's a feasible action, that's perfectly okay with us. Could it be a feasible action? That depends on the model. Nothing in our framework tells you what should count or not count as a feasible action, but I should say that this is the same issue in standard decision theory, that standard decision theory, decision problem comes along with a set of feasible actions. Those are the only ones you get to choose among. And if you are the policymaker / modeler, you have to make the case that the set of actions that you chose was an appropriate set of actions, right? I think in all of this stuff that what I take, this goes back to my work in causality, but causality is also relative. And my sense is that currently, not only does law have a bad definition of causality, but by and large, lawyers talk past each other when they're talking about causality. They have different definitions in mind, and they just get on their high horse and talk. Now, it's not that my definition of causality is going to solve all their problems, but at least if they're using the same definition, we can understand, okay, they're disagreeing. Are they disagreeing about the model? If so, what are the disagreements? Which model seems more reasonable? Sure, we could disagree. If they're agreeing on the model, somebody did the math wrong because they're apparently using the same definition. So I'd like to extend that to harm. Same thing, that there's nothing in our work right now that tells you how you should choose the model, how you should choose the actions, how you should choose the feasible actions, how you should define harm. But at least if different policymakers disagree, if they're all using our definition, you could see, I think, far more clearly where the disagreement lies. Now, that doesn't necessarily help you solve the problem, but I actually think it's an important first step. If before you're just talking past each other, well, then it's impossible to solve the problem. So, my 2 cents. Yeah.
I'm interested in the dual notion of benefit. So when you defined your harm, you had this max of 0 and the difference, right?
Yeah, the max would become
So,
min.
I'm just saying, like, what if you just didn't do max of 0 in that thing? You just calculate what it was, and a beneficial thing would have negative values for
Yeah, so that would be
a negative harm is benefit, is what I'm saying.
right.
Why not
That would be
that
the case of
instead of cutting
saying
off?
that the default for harm and benefit were the same. And my claim is, and this is what I would want to verify empirically, that people might not think about it that way. That they might be using different defaults for harm and benefit, and this is not a matter of theory.
Right. So the examples, if I take away one bagel from you versus I give you a bagel,
Right.
that's much worse to take away a bagel than to give you.
For example.
So like -1 is not, it doesn't work
So
for everybody.
fix that with utility, but I think in general you need to be careful. So again, we don't tell you what to do, and if you want to take benefit to be the negative of harm, I can tell you technically what it means. Nothing prevents that, but I just don't know if it's true all the time. True in the sense of empirically, you know, if you did tests, is that how people think about it? And I think it's worth understanding. So I think a lot of these, you know, the thing I'm most interested in right now is understanding the extent to which our definitions match the way people think about these problems. Yeah.
Just to build on this, I wonder if there are examples where the default for harm is higher than the default for benefit. Because I feel like you might get lots of like irrational actors kind of exploding and thinking that they're being imposed upon who treat it like that. But I wonder if you could get kind of the examples that look more reasonable or more rational. Maybe if you had an agent who is incredibly powerful, like a company that really impacts your life.
Right.
So whatever happens, you either feel like you're harmed or you're benefited by their
Right.
actions.
All I can say is I haven't thought about this enough, so it's a really interesting question. I don't know. Certainly there's nothing in our model that requires that the default for harm be less than default for benefit. You could have it the other way around. It would be really interesting to come up with examples where, you know, realistic examples where that's the way things went. So I don't have any, you know, at my fingertips, but it doesn't seem to me impossible. I think it'd be really interesting.
So would that mean that you could be both harmed and benefited by the same
Yes,
the same action?
that's what it would be.
Yeah.
I feel that.
It seems like that would, it seems like that would only be possible if you had like different respects of harm and benefit. Like you're harmed in one respect but benefited in another respect.
Yeah, so right now we're taking utility to be a single number.
Yeah.
And utilities are totally ordered. Now you might argue in the real world it might be more reasonable to look at multi-attribute utilities where you have sets of numbers, so it makes sense to talk about being harmed in one aspect and benefit in another.
Right.
Then you have to think about how to modify our definitions. I mean, the simplest thing to do would be somehow to convert the set of numbers, you know, by taking linear combination to a single number. It's not clear that's reasonable. So once you allow multi-attribute utilities, things become interesting. Likewise, if you allow uncertainty to be represented by a set of probabilities or some other approach, things become interesting. So, future research. But I could imagine that there would be examples where, especially if you start thinking about multi-attribute utilities, you get some interesting phenomena.